Hi, welcome to the Sanford Imaginetics lecture series. I'm Dr. Isom Ward, and today I'm going to be talking about the genetics of mental health. Before we begin, I will point out that I have no financial relationships or drug investigational studies currently active. The general plan for this lecture is I'll start out by talking about the history of psychiatry and the diagnosis of mental health disorders, and specifically how that is so different from other areas of medicine and how that affects our search for the genetic causes of psychiatric disorders. And then gradually transition into talking about the current progress that we're making in psychiatric genetics, what do we know and what do we know we don't know, and how that is already being applied to clinical psychiatry currently. So psychiatry begins in the 19th century, and in its early beginnings there was not a clear distinction between psychiatry and neurology. They were all conditions of the mind studied by the same people. And the first mention of any distinction draws the description as between diseases of the mind and diseases of the nervous system, or that is, conditions that are more related to people's behaviors versus things that are related to externally visible phenomena. Even things like epilepsy, which we take for granted as a neurological disorder now, were considered to be psychiatric at that time. And this was simply because at that time there was nothing known about the structure of the brain. And a good way to explain how these two fields have developed is that psychiatry has always generally included the neurological disorders that have to do with parts of the brain that we don't understand very well. And so that means that over time, things that used to be considered psychiatric, as psychiatry became more and more of an independent specialty, it also had to understand its role in relation to psychology. And this is a difficult thing to explain to people. In essence, psychiatry is the study of behavioral and emotional disorders and thought disorders that are such that they are related to the physical structure of the brain, whereas psychology deals with the elements that are believed to be non-deterministic, being relied on a person's environmental features or their own personal choices. And in some ways this sort of mirrors the often cited nature versus nurture hypothesis. And so, like with many areas of medicine, it remains unclear to which degree each area contributes. But the two fields have co-evolved and have trended towards working synchronously but separately. And this varies from region to region. In the United States, psychiatrists and psychologists work quite differently, whereas in Europe, it's still common for psychiatrists to also provide psychotherapy. There has been a gradually increasing interest from the public in psychiatric disease and psychological theory. And this has been both helpful and damaging. It's been helpful in the sense that society has developed a better appreciation that mental and emotional health are important for day-to-day life, and it's something that all people share. At the same time, it's the misunderstanding of the medical literature has left to a lot of very destructive stereotypes perseverating throughout the media, movies, etc. And a big part of this is that it has led to a stigma of unrealness, or the idea that psychiatric symptoms are only in someone's head, they're not real. And that has been very hurtful, both socially for people who have mental illness, but also in the healthcare industry, as this belief has also permeated into the thinking of physicians that work outside of these areas. Genetics, on the other hand, has developed almost completely independently from psychiatry. The closest it gets to it is that there has been a close relationship between genetics and neurology. And it also begins in the 19th century, but really not until the late decades. Gregor Mendel is considered generally to be the main progenitor of genetics. And some of you may have run into this guy in high school. He was an Augustinian friar that lived in a monastery, and he came up with the basic theories of genetics based on observing how traits are passed between generations of pea plants. He developed the concept of how traits are transferred from generation to generation, but not the mechanism that this was accomplished. It would be much later before we would understand what DNA was. The basic concepts that Mendel established are best displayed by something called a Punnett square, which shows that traits are inherited in a method called independent segregation. Meaning, suppose a theoretical situation here, as you see on the screen on the right, where you have a theoretical gene that is carried by the mother and father, listed on each side, and each person carries 2 copies of every gene. In this case, we're going to say that the capital A represents a healthy gene and the lowercase a represents an unhealthy gene. And then we have a finite number of possibilities that can occur from a mating between this mother and father. 25% of the time, the child will inherit both a copy of the healthy gene from each parent. 50% of the time, they'll inherit one of each. And 25% of the time, they'll inherit 2 copies of the unhealthy gene. When a person is required to inherit 2 copies of an unhealthy gene in order to be sick, that's considered a recessive disorder. And if you only need 1 copy of the unhealthy gene, that is considered a dominant disorder. The next 100 years of human genetics has changed a lot, and I'll do my best to summarize things. Basically, it comes down to humans are a lot more complicated than pea plants. And there are 2 major concepts that I'd like you to know about and understand the rest of this lecture, which is that, unlike with plants, any given genetic variation does not usually cause a disease with 100% certainty. And the rate at which the likelihood of causing a disease is called penetrance. If a person inherits a genetic variant, they do not reliably cause all symptoms in all people who inherit the variation, and this is called expressivity. And this leads us to an important philosophical question about genetics in complex animals like humans, is where do you draw the line of causality? Would you say that if you had a variation in a gene that made you have an 80% likelihood of having a disease, would you say that is causative? Most people would. How about 50% or 10%? In the current state of genetics, there are about 7,000 genetic disorders that are what we call Mendelian, or they're inherited in that method that I just demonstrated for you. And about 3,000 of these disorders result in neurological. And despite this, there is not any one gene that is known to cause a psychiatric symptom in and of itself. However, there are genetic causes of psychiatric disease, and that should sound confusing now, and hopefully if I do a good job describing this, you'll understand what I mean by this by the end of the lecture. And we very much want to know, as geneticists, we very much want to know why this is, what makes psychiatric disease different from other illnesses. We would first ask the question, are psychiatric disorders genetic? Recall the debate of nature versus nurture. Is it possible that all psychiatric disorders are due to a person's environment and genetics doesn't have a big factor in it? Well, we have considerable evidence against this. First of all, we know that you can develop psychiatric disease or cause psychiatric disease in people either through disease or through chemicals, either whether recreational drugs or pharmaceuticals. There are numerous examples of how you can induce psychiatric symptoms in people, and disorders which we know degrade the brain, such as Alzheimer's disease, also lead to psychiatric disease. We also know through studies of the general population, identical twin studies have established that the likelihood of developing psychiatric disease between identical twins who are separated at birth is essentially identical, which actually establishes that genetics should be a greater cause than environment. And when we do heritability calculations in large families of psychiatric disease, we get an estimation of 0.4 to 0.8, and that basically translates to a 40%, 80% correlation, meaning that 40 to 80% of the likelihood of inheriting it can be attributed to genetics. That's actually, even 0.4 is actually extremely high. To give you some reference, heritability calculations for common diseases like diabetes or cardiovascular disease often come out with heritability calculations around 0.2 to 0.3, and that's even though we know we even actually have specific genes that will cause diabetes and heart disease. And so yes, we're left in the dark again as why we cannot find them for psychiatric disease. And finally, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, just because something is genetic doesn't mean it's caused by a single gene. So are psychiatric symptoms caused by a single gene, or is the reason we're not finding them is because it's always due to multiple genetic factors? The biggest reason why we have so much difficulty getting at psychiatric disease from a genetic perspective is that there is a great reliance of genetics on what is considered objective information, or specifically interpreting the human genome requires this. The reason for this is because when you look at people's DNA, they differ. Every individual person will differ from another by quite a lot of ways. And it can be difficult to tell whether or not a change is good, neutral, or bad. And the way that we have always figured this out is by grouping people together by symptoms that we know for a fact that they share and realizing that they all share the same genetic trait. In fact, this is so powerful, you can sometimes determine the genetic cause of a disease with as few as 3 people if you are absolutely certain that they have the exact same symptom and there is nothing else that causes this symptom. And what you see here is 2 pictures of a person's body who has a condition called neurofibromatosis type 1. And this would be the example of one of the few totally objective diagnoses in the genetics world. What you're seeing here on the left is this person has freckles in their armpit, and then on the right is something called a cafe au lait macule. And I can tell you that if I see a person with this kind of freckling and they have at least 6 of these cafe au lait macules, I can diagnose them with neurofibromatosis type 1 without doing any genetic testing. I already know exactly which gene it is, and I don't even look for it. It's that reliable. Nothing else causes symptoms in these pairs. On the other hand, what is subjectivity in human physiology? I'll give you an interesting example. How do you know that the color blue looks the same to you as it does to other people? This is kind of almost like a philosophy question, but it got brought into the realm of genetic science because some geneticists were able to figure out that there should be people who can see more than the 1 million colors that the average person has. You see on this picture on the right, this is a little diagram of the eye. You see color by these things called cone cells, and you have cone cells for blue, red, and green. And this is actually where the RGB color format on your computer is derived from human vision. Geneticists determined that there should be people out there who have an extra cone cell, and they would be able to see up to 100 million colors. And yet no one had ever reported being able to do that. So they went out and looked through people's DNA to find these people and brought them in and tested them out and found out, indeed, they do exist. And when you give them color differentiation tests, they can in fact determine this many colors. However, they weren't aware of it, because having grown up around people who could only see 1 million colors, they learned to group all the additional colors they saw into the same framework that we describe in. So they described the world in the same way and didn't know that there was any difference. So if you imagine how difficult it is a person to realize that difference in the way they're perceiving the world, how much more difficult would it be for someone to know whether or not they feel the same way as another person. Psychiatric disorders are diagnosed using something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And we are currently on revision 5, so by short it's referred to as the DSM-5. And this is a guide for categorizing mental health complaints based on symptoms. It has been a great tool and helped many people, so I would make sure, by talking about the slide, I'm not saying I don't support this method or this is not a good thing, but it does have a number of areas, does pose a number of perplexing problems as far as categorizing mental health disorders as brain diseases. First of all, we sort of already talked about. Many of the symptoms listed in the DSM-5 are based on patient report, describing how they feel, which we just established is somewhat framed by your cultural experiences. Some diagnoses rely on situational descriptors. For instance, separation anxiety disorder requires you to be in a certain situation. Does anxiety, because of a certain situation, actually differ physiologically from anxiety due to other things? Difficult to say. And then also, categorization of the symptoms by the person doing the interview might be subjective. For instance, anxiety versus aversion. I have personally dealt with children who were mistakenly diagnosed with aversion to social interactions due to autistic type features, when actually they simply had crippling social anxiety and were afraid to interact with people. And those things can be very difficult to sort out. And there's a lot of arguing about, the categorizations and how they should be judged and administered. But most physicians, and psychiatrists included, agree that diagnosing people with this method most likely does not group people by what is actually going on in their brain. And so we're left with a couple of possibilities. One, individual symptoms, for instance, anxiety, may represent a mixture of different feelings that have been culturally wrapped up into a single word. Or all the people who have a certain symptom, like anxiety, represent a mixture of different physical changes in the brain that all result in the same symptom. It's probably a little bit of both. But this is a big problem for genetics. Genetics and subjectivity do not go easily together, but we have some modern techniques for trying to cut through this what we call statistical noise. So suppose these three figures represent three people. I did my best to make them look like people. And each letter in there represents a gene, and say all three of these people have problems with anxiety. Well, you can see here we don't have a lot of information because they all have a total of 9 different variations of this gene, so I really couldn't say at all which one is driving it. And what we can do then, what we frequently do is we can get huge numbers of people together. This is as many as I can fit on one screen. And using computers, we can start to realize that if we get enough people together, we start to see patterns in there. That certain genes are more common to occur and people have what we're looking for than others. And so this is a small number. If I gave you enough time to look at this out yourself, you could probably find these patterns. But try doing this with 10,000 people. You need a computer. And these are called genome-wide association studies. And I wanted to point them out specifically because anytime you read a news article about a new genetic study that's come out and says that a gene has been found to be related to a disease, usually they're talking about one of these studies. And it's kind of misleading because what these do is they find association, like the name implies. But in science, we say correlation does not equal causation, meaning just because the gene you find is associated with people doesn't mean it's the cause of that. There might be something else in common between the people that's unrelated to what you're looking at. So you have to be very careful in interpreting these studies. On the other hand, recall that I said that there are some genetic disorders that cause psychiatric disease, but not specific symptoms. What did I mean by that? Well, some causes of psychiatric disease actually found us without us trying to look for them. Back in the 1960s, a syndrome was named called DIGEORGE syndrome that was used to describe children who were born with a certain type of birth defect, where they would have underdevelopment of the thymus, which is an organ that controls your immune system, and the parathyroid gland. And this was really no big deal. Geneticists know hundreds of birth defect sequences and syndrome names for different birth defect sequences. And a couple of decades later, we figured out what usually caused it. And it was a deletion at a certain address on a chromosome, on chromosome 22. You see here it says 22q11.2. That's the 22nd chromosome. And the Q11.2, that's an address. It doesn't worry about that. And I'll just point out, this is something that's a bit different from a Mendelian disease where you're talking about a single gene. When you say it's deleted, I'm talking about it's like someone reached into a book and pulled out several pages. And so these people are missing several genes. And this was not an uncommon finding for birth defects. We found lots of deletions throughout the genome that cause birth defects. And for a long time, we just screened people for this if they had consistent features. They had the birth defects we were looking for. Well, something big changed in the 2000s. We had a revolution in genetic testing, and all of a sudden we were able to quickly screen people's genomes for these types of genetic changes. And so geneticists started doing that. We started doing it for all the kids we had that didn't fit into any of the previous diagnostic categories. And this is children who were developmentally delayed or had an intellectual disability or maybe a single birth defect. And what we found out is many people had this deletion, way more than we would have anticipated. Current estimated is that there's about 1 in 3,000 people have this deletion. And that included not only kids who were developmentally delayed or had a single birth defect, but even children that don't have any birth defects, that appear healthy, live independently. Often their parents of a child who had a birth defect would be found to have this. And so the reasons for this, how it occurs, is a lecture in and of itself. But what is more important is what we then found out about this condition after we discovered so many people with it. And we found out that 3 major things. One is that the average IQ for a person with this condition is 74. And that means that almost half of people with this condition actually have a normal range IQ. Anything above 70 is considered normal range. We realized that the likelihood of developing a psychotic spectrum disorder like schizophrenia was about 25 to 40% increase over the general population. And then thirdly, that there was at least a 60% to 70% lifetime risk of developing any psychiatric disease if you had this deletion. And most importantly, is it didn't matter if you had any of the other physical symptoms. You could have no birth defects, you could have done okay in school, and you would still be at risk for this. And so this means that a significant percentage of the psychiatric population, current estimate is around 1 in 100 to 1 in 200 people with schizophrenia, have this condition. And we all agree that we still aren't done seeing what impact this has on society. What we've learned from this is several things. When we look at how these types of conditions, and it's not the only one, we've discovered about 5 others that cause a similar disease pattern. We learned that these people are at risk for all types of psychiatric disease at the same time. They're at increased risk for anxiety, for depression, for psychotic disorders, for ADHD, etc. And interestingly, the risk of getting one condition or the other, ADHD versus anxiety, depression versus obsessive compulsive disorder, the individual likelihood of getting those is the same as the general population. It just increases your overall risk. And the best explanation we have for this is that there is a physical threshold of the brain, meaning that there are certain genetic factors that affect your brain development or interfere with your brain development. And if you're born with a sick brain, the more likely you are to develop a psychiatric illness. And it can be so severe that you're almost guaranteed psychiatric disease. However, which particular set of symptoms you develop, we cannot predict. This is something we don't understand. It may be that is fully environmental, whether you have problems with anxiety versus depression. It could be that there are more genetic factors that complement this, or it may be random, actually. And that, again, is another tangent I could go down if anyone wants to ask about it. But that is where we are at right now as far as determinants of psychiatric disease. But this is extremely important, not only because this is the first time in all of human history since, in these over 200 years of psychiatric practice that we have found causes for psychiatric disease, but it will complement the other type of research we have done. We have learned that they do differ from other people in the psychiatric population. They are more likely to have lifelong problems with psychiatric disease. They're more likely to have multiple psychiatric diagnoses. They're more likely to respond poorly to medications. And so we are working out ways to know when we should test people for these conditions based on this. And we can improve, we've already made improvements in people's lives simply by making this diagnosis, because several people have personally confided in me that it was life-changing for them to simply understand that there was a specific cause for what happened to them. And there wasn't anything they were doing wrong or anything that they needed to change was going to change their diagnosis. They just had to learn how to deal with it and move on. We are most excited because now that we know about these genetic changes, we can look and see what physiologic changes occur in the brains of people with these conditions, which can then lead us to start devising therapies that counteract those changes and see if they have the effects we expect on psychiatric symptoms. And so I think in the next 2 decades, we're going to be looking at a great improvement in medications for psychiatric disease because of being able to study people with these conditions. And finally, I would like to conclude with a secondary consideration, is because we can get very excited about talking about these and forget to consider how this affects our society. As genetics becomes more nuanced, we begin to understand better how the brain develops, how psychiatric disease develops, and begin to understand that there's no clear cutoff between when a person is necessarily sick with respect to emotional or behavioral health, and that there's no strict cutoff of when a person is capable or incapable of caring for themselves. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, and I don't have an answer to this is just for you, how do you utilize advanced technologies like these without putting labels on people that are limiting, without forcing social stratification? And that sort of is a loaded question. Some would argue that we have social stratification now so that it wouldn't really change anything. You have to remember many of these people with these conditions, like we talked about with 22q, have normal range IQs. They have independent thoughts and their personal goals, moral compass. Can we ethically force them to do anything for themselves based on knowing that they do have a neurological disorder? These are tough questions to answer. And so in summary, I just want to point out that we do know some causes of psychiatric disease, but we do not understand why symptoms differ between people. We can improve care for people with these conditions by anticipating these outcomes and treating them earlier. And we are gradually making progress and improving pharmacotherapy for these conditions based on understanding the physical changes that these genetic disorders cause in the brain. But we have to find these people before we can help them. So if you know anyone who's suffering from severe psychiatric illness, please let them know we're here to help, always to offer consultation to anyone who wants more information about the genetics or hereditary of genetic disease. Thank you for listening to my lecture today. I hope you found it informative, and I hope it has inspired interest in psychiatric genetics for you. If you do, we would love to hear from you. And we are always happy to answer any questions for both patients and people studying neurological and psychiatric disease.